of the Institute?
Look, I think, Lorenzo, what I would like to do is thank you and Des for putting together this magnificent and very stimulating series. I feel like we've collectively been running a bit of a marathon through the last 8 weeks. There have been many highlights, there have been many interesting strands, and I feel like some of the key strands have followed the whole way through and probably will stay with us for some time, and many of us will take those strands into other things that we're thinking about. It's a particular pleasure today. I'm sitting here in my office at IPCS looking at Danish and Andre, who are just around the corner in the boardroom here. So that feels pretty cool as a way to end, to feel like things are, that finally we're ending back in place rather than just existing as these terrible little Zoom squares. And I'd particularly like to thank Carlos for doing an extraordinary job. This has been one hell of a commitment for Carlos in terms of the time involved in not only setting up the meetings, but looking after the recording, sending out all of the notices, keeping all of the tech sharply working. So a big shout out to Carlos on behalf of all of us. And also just to say how fabulous this has been in feeling like we're hitting a bit of a transnational community in a way that only Zoom has allowed us to do. And for many of us, the move to Zoom was one that we made quite reticently. Here at IPCS, we spent quite some time thinking about whether we would come onto Zoom at all. But it was actually Lorenzo and Des who provoked this move, if you like. And I think from my own perspective, it's been really tremendous, and it's given us inspiration to go on and do all sorts of other things that we're now also doing on Zoom. But I really hope that in the new year, we'll be able to welcome plenty of you actually into this building and to continue doing what we especially like doing, which is all sitting in a room together and building these really important discussions. So that's more than enough from me. Thanks, Lorraine.
Thank you, Melinda. I personally can't wait to make my own personal pilgrimage to the Institute. I also wanted to say that Des won't be able to attend the session today. He's presenting for an institution, I'm not sure, in Vancouver, and so I'll be chairing today. But hopefully, I will not do anything at all. In fact, I'm really confident that the conversation will run itself. So we have 3 papers as usual, as has been the format of these sessions, and we got Danish and Andre presenting, and the season finale, this final session is dedicated to a consideration of how we can get out of the bubble. How do we burst this bubble, and so on and so forth. So I'm glad that everybody managed to continue attending. We are a band of hardened veterans of the bubbles and the wars surrounding the bubbles. So you guys are on. Welcome. Danish. We cannot hear you guys.
We won't say anything, sorry, 1 second. Just trying to, yeah. Hello everyone. As Carlos mentioned, we're seated inside the Philip Darby Reading Room in the Institute of Postcolonial Studies. We acknowledge that the Institute stands on the customary lands of the Wurundjeri people, and we pay respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. So what follows now is an account of a reading project. We provisionally label this as a project of post-critical reading. So the term post-critique, coming from the literary critic Peter Felsky. The two of us are PhD candidates at the Melbourne Law School early in our respective journeys. We encountered Felsky in January of 2020. And we were quite struck by her description of critique, which she equates with what she calls the hermeneutics of suspicion, or rather a term that she borrows from Paul Ricoeur. So critique here is characterized by a set of practices that are vigilant, detached, that attempt to uncover something that's hidden in the text, that are wary of the text. And Felsky, in her book, The Limits of Critique, asks us to take note of the affects that come attached to critique and take note of the metaphors through which critique does its work, through which the critic digs down or stands back, uncovers, unearths. And she asks, what else can we do to engage with the text? What other intellectual and imaginative alternatives might be marshaled under the label of what we might call post-critique? So we began with this reading project. We started with interlocutors that Felsky herself identifies explicitly. So we had Bruno Latour and his work on actor network theory. We had Eve Sedgwick and her reparative reading practice. Our reading list evolved as the year went on to encompass themes and concerns that we identified as correlating with a post-critical practice. So what follows now is an account of a set of encounters with theory over the course of a year, with theory that pushes against the hermeneutics of suspicion in a year where it's been very difficult to not feel suspicious and wary and vigilant. And in our telling, we pay attention to the time and place of our encounters with our interlocutors. We also pay attention to the metaphors through which post-critique is conducted. So the seminar series began with a session that asked the question, can we remake the world through metaphor? We hold on to that possibility. Instead of asking can, we explore how we might go about this task of remaking. So over to Andre.
In early March, when time slowed down, but before the restrictions began, we read Bruno Latour's polemic against critique. It was the first piece we read for this project, and the last we read together in the common room on the 9th floor of the law school. Latour begins his article with a metaphor with war, which he calls the metaphorical atmosphere of the time. He is thinking of culture war, the science war, wars against terrorism and against poverty. All these wars are fought with weapons. Critique is a powerful one. It destroys, it debunks. Critique is just the weapon you need to go to war with the church, with God. But critique is the proverbial double-edged sword. It cuts both ways. It debunks its own debunking. It eats its own children. Latour means that he is worried about what happens when his enemies espouse critique, when a Republican strategist talks about preventing action on climate change by focusing on the lack of scientific certainty. Latour asks, what has become of critique when the NSA takes up Foucault? It's not enough, says Latour, to disarm, to put down the weapon that is critique. We need something to replace it with, something that will remake the world rather than just sweep the old one away. He first tries to redescribe the critic as the one who assembles rather than debunks, the one for whom, if something is constructed, then it means it is fragile and thus in great need of care and caution. But this description of what it is to be a scholar is not enough. Having distilled his theoretical argument, he faces a practical problem: to associate the word criticism with a whole set of new positive metaphors. He makes it very clear. Metaphors are a matter of practicality, of practice. Metaphors do something in the world. We do things with metaphors.
Eve Sedgwick's essay on paranoid and reparative reading is the first to get the Zoom treatment as we settle into lockdown life. If Latour wants to associate the word criticism with a set of positive metaphors, Sedgwick starts to construct those metaphors. So through a reparative practice, Sedgwick wants us to be able to attune to surprise, to new ways of knowing. In contrast to a paranoid mode of inquiry, which always seeks to uncover, to expose something that is otherwise considered not visible, reparative reading acknowledges the reality of oppression and then asks, how might we find ways of living in the world? So instead of looking beneath, Sedgwick gives us a different kind of prepositional metaphor. She encourages us to look beside. Beside has a grounding, non-dualistic quality for her. It allows a number of elements to lie alongside each other. So the image that she evokes is the palm of an open hand, where life, love, and ideas might sit freely for a while. In a particularly striking segment that we pause to read together, Sedgwick gives us a way of holding life, love, and ideas together. This is a story about friendship, a story with 3 of her friends, 2 of them aged 30, the other 60. Sedgwick herself is 45, in the middle. Now, in one version of this narrative, a regular generational story which follows linear time, the youngest might find themselves in a few years where Sedgwick is at present. Sedgwick might look to the older friend as a potential future mirror, but this will not be their story. See, Sedgwick has incurable breast cancer. One of her younger friends lives with HIV at a moment where antiretrovirals are yet to guarantee a full life. The other has advanced cancer. So contingency marks their relations. Their life narratives will not overlap. There is, however, she says, and I quote, another sense in which they slide up more intimately alongside one another than can any lives that are moving forward according to the regular schedule of the generations. It is one another immediately, one another as the present fullness of a becoming whose arc may extend no further, whom we must each learn best to apprehend, fulfill, and bear company. This elegiac paragraph tells us some of the work that thinking beside does for Sedgwick, as well as capturing the lived experience from which it emerges. So to think beside is to think with, to live with, to join life and thought together.
To be beside something suggests proximity, a relation of some kind, but also a certain level of separation, or at least the absence of total identification. We read an interview with Karen Barrard in April. If time slowed down in March, then it disappears in April, collapsing, as Danish says in our WhatsApp chat, into quick nothingness. Barrard, we discover, uses the word entanglement to describe this being beside, in relation but distinct, separate but linked. Barrard's invocation of entanglement is in opposition to the standard account of scientific objectivity, which presupposes distance between the observer and the object. We can think here of the critic who stands back from his object and so can see what no one else can see, how the object is a symptom of one of those great critical concepts, society, modernity, capitalism. For that kind of critic, to be entangled with an object is to be mystified by it, and what a critic does more than anything else is demystify. Barrard turns to a stream of metaphors to undo this association between distance and objectivity. One of those metaphors is the cut, through which she reminds us of the materiality of thinking. We are entangled with the objects we observe, then there can be no distinction between abstract knowing and material practice. Instead, everything exists beside everything else. Self, objects, knowledge, justice, in an interconnected fabric that Barrard calls space-time mattering. To know is to cut into this fabric, to artificially separate some measure of space-time mattering for our own purposes. Knowing, says Barrard, is a direct material engagement, a cutting together apart, where cuts do violence but also open up and rework agential conditions of possibility. So this cutting, this knowing, doesn't untangle us. On the contrary, she says that what is on the other side of the agential cut is never separate from us, which means that we are always responsible both for the cutting and for what is on the other side of the cut. As Barrard says, even the smallest cuts matter.
The utopias of Jose Esteban Munoz are material too, concrete worlds that might be daydream-like but exist in the here and now, if we only know how to look for them. We might find them, Munoz tells us, through a form of astonished contemplation. As we read Munoz, it's early May and Melbourne is opening up. The lockdown seems to have worked. Cases have trickled into single digits. On my daily walks around my neighborhood, I find myself attuning to wonder. I notice the gentle undulations of Hotham Hill, which allow the sky to leap right into me as I walk around corners. An alleyway seems to empty out unbroken into a faraway slab of glass and concrete piercing the sky. Violent red leaves smatter the tarmac leading up to my house. It is a good time to feel wonder. It is an easy time to feel wonder. It looks like our public health response has provided a model that might just be replicated in other countries battling the virus. In the countries that are struggling, surprising, unexpected progressive victories abound. Right-wing governments in the US and the UK find themselves in a position where they enact the kind of welfare schemes that progressives have only dreamed of. Where governments fall short, mutual aid groups spring up and work through the last mile. Mask sewing squads, retired healthcare volunteers, food supplies, emotional support, and so we dream with Munoz. Little communities of support, tiny glimpses of utopia.
I don't know how to find something to write about in the pain of this deadly world. We read this line from the opening chapter of Patricia Williams's The Alchemy of Race and Rights in July. May's hope is all but gone. All of Melbourne is under stage 3 lockdown, cases are spiralling. We are struck at first not by Williams's use of metaphor, but by her mood. She's very depressed. She's thinking, I hate being a lawyer. We seem to be very far from Munoz's astonished contemplation. But the structuring metaphor announced in her title suggests otherwise. Feeling my way through the metaphor, I wonder at its instability, its ambivalence. Alchemy is a pseudoscience, superstitious magic. It is also the transmutation of one thing into another. Walking through Royal Park, we were allowed to walk together in July. Danish and I agree that there is something striking about the line. I look for her shape and his hand. We're each struck by the line, but neither of us fully understands it. Her is Williams's great-great-grandmother. His is the 30-year-old lawyer who bought her, age 13. The man who raped her, who made her bear his children, his property. The man who was Williams's great-great-grandfather. Williams says she is looking for his hand. It is a metaphor for his words in legal writing and in judgments, his signature on bills of sale for his slaves. Williams says she is looking for her shape. It is a metaphor for the absence of her great-great-grandmother in the records. There is no death, neither cause nor date recorded, no grave or body. Williams writes, I see her shape in his hand in the vast networking of our society and in the evils and oversights that plague our lives and laws. The hand which is writing, which is law, is force, violence, coercion, while the shape describes the absence of choice, the void where a person might be, erased by the violence of the hand. She, Williams, feels the force of that dead hand in the shape of her life today. But Williams, the alchemist, wants to reverse this. And isn't there something reparative in this reversal, perhaps even utopian? It is with her hand, her writing, her legal scholarship, that she seeks to fill in the shape of her great-great-grandmother.
For the first time since we have started this reading project, for the first time in my PhD journey, I look at the notes stacked on my table, at all my work, and think calmly, fuck this. We are at a point in this new lockdown where the end is nowhere in sight. I sink just a bit more every day into a sticky tar pit of depressiveness. The face staring back at me from the mirror is unrecognizable. I watch the Victorian Premier's daily press conferences with increasing bitterness. We must unite in the fight against this wicked, stubborn virus, he says. And all I can think is, where is the united we in the racial profiling, in the fingers pointed at migrant communities and precarious workers to cover up the spectacular failures of contact tracing and health department communication? I am radiant with suspicion. Our reading project has come to an indefinite pause. Our WhatsApp chat has gone silent. I flicked through the conversation idly, hoping to find some way back, scrolling up to find a message from Andre when all of this began. If not reparative reading now, then when? Indeed. In Maria Tumarkin's Axiomatic, we find a mirror and a balm for this bone-deep weariness. She asks us, can you remember the last time life felt long or kind, or like it was yours and mine. The section we are reading is named after an axiom, as are all the other sections. This one is titled History Repeats Itself, and we linger over its observations about people who have come undone in the entanglements with the law, often caught in repetitive loops of drug abuse within an unsparing criminal justice system. Tamarkin meets a community lawyer, Wanda, battling within the system to roll the rocks out of her client's way, even as they keep rolling back. If this sounds unsparingly bleak and Sisyphean, Tamarkin comes to a surprising observation about this repetitiveness by way of Kierkegaard. A metaphor is involved, a garment. For him, hope's garment is new and stiff, while recollection's garment is discarded. It doesn't fit. Repetition, however, is an indestructible garment. It neither binds nor sags. We do not tilt back in time when we repeat. Instead, we tilt imperceptibly into the future. There isn't some major transformative moment of repair here, no glistening utopia to be constructed. Instead, it is in the almost imperceptible of moments, the benign repetition of daily acts, that Tamarkin tells us, that an invisible net is cast, holding people up, protecting them, because the things being repeated are never the same. That imperceptible difference, same damn thing, same blessed thing, is what rescues it. After we finish our conversation, I pick a cloth mask from my increasingly large pile and head outdoors for a very long walk.
This has been an account of an ongoing experiment in trying not only to read post-critically, but to live with those readings, to live with feeling. To that end, we kept the reading list open rather than determining from the outset what we would read. That meant that in choosing our readings, we were guided both by what we had just read and what was happening in the world. In an essay on attunement, Zadie Smith wrote that it can be easier to attune yourself to something when you're not an expert in it. Your non-expertise allows you to experience the thing more openly. As PhD students, we've tried to use our non-expertise in that way, to try to attune ourselves to what each text tells us anachronistically about our own time, this year of the pandemic. Janet Halley, the feminist legal scholar, wrote in an essay of her late friend Eve Sedgwick's playful translation of dark into bright possibilities and the power of the rereading strategy. It is in the spirit of playful translation that we have taken up a series of metaphors. Some are about how to do scholarship, others are about intellectual roles, some are propositional metaphors. The metaphors include assembling and curating, looking beside, cutting together apart, astonished contemplation, alchemy, a garment that neither binds nor sags. If these metaphors seem only loosely connected, if the sheer number of them seems overwhelming, that is perhaps reflective of our own non-linear trajectory. Despite the label of post-critique with which we began this paper, we are not past or beyond critique. We have not finished with suspicion. Throughout this year, we have oscillated, sometimes quite wildly, between hope and despair, between reparative reading and suspicious reading. The value of the metaphors we have traversed is that they have at least attuned us to non-suspicious possibilities and readings. And where suspicion cannot or must not be put aside, it has attuned us to the affects and effects of suspicious reading.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. What a way to start. Kevin, you're next.
Hi, Kevin. Just give me a second while I make you co-host. And thank you, Danish. Thank you, Andre.
Thanks very much, Lorenzo and Des, for this wonderful series, for helping us unlock lockdown. Greetings from Brunswick and now Melbourne, the land of the Wurundjeri people. And thanks very much, Danish and Andre, for your presentation. I think the opposition between beneath and besides has a great relevance to what I hope to share this afternoon. Published in 2014, Going South, Why Britain Will Have a Third World Economy, sought to raise concerns about the state of the United Kingdom, in particular, its place in the Premier League of developed first world nations. The introduction described a decline from preeminent global superpower to developing country or emerging market, part of the global south. Spectres were raised. This anxiety was evident particularly in chapter titles such as Lagos on the Thames. But for our purposes today, it's the book's cover which tells the story. The vertiginous plunge in the world's rankings is illustrated with a vertically arranged arrow pointing down. The direction south has very much come to be associated with failure. Let's start with the phrase going south, which is a common idiom for journalists when dramatizing a collapse. How did it come to be? Most explanations of the phrase going south attribute it to the game of poker, referencing a gambler who heads to Mexico when the debts mount up. But this phrase has come into its own, particularly during the 2008 financial crisis, as indicated by this Google Ngram. It's supported by an implied reference to the graphs that show stocks falling. But it's not only the transatlantic north that sees the world arranged thus. Even in a country like Australia, down under, looking up, we've internalized this hierarchy, as in a headline for this article about the ACT economy. In this talk, I will attempt to understand the dynamics of South as a metaphor of verticality. I hope that this contributes to the ongoing analysis of the metaphorical architecture of colonialism and also the strategy for upending this arrangement. So says Jorge Luis Borges in his 1951 essay, Pascal's Sphere. With the understanding that South as down, we're dealing with a root metaphor that seems hardly a metaphor at all. Paul Ricoeur writes about Verticalism as a narrative entanglement, which enables us to make sense of the world in the mode of a Kantian a priori. A most obvious comparison is the use of light to signify knowledge, which Derrida described as a heliocentrism evoked in Plato's myth of the cave. While it seems natural that light reveals and thus makes the world knowable, the light metaphor became weaponized during colonialism, particularly with the slave trade, when it was generalized to skin color. Verticality might also be considered a root metaphor of hierarchy. In every way, what is above seems superior to what is below. But need this be so? In a recent conversation article, Professor of Marketing, Aradhana Krishna, ascribed this to our experience as children, when we see adults as taller and more powerful. Her research has shown that symbols placed higher on the page are perceived as more powerful. Rudolf Arnheim attributes this hierarchy to gravity, which gives greater power to the one who is higher up. And this would apply to vision as well, giving greater knowledge to the one who is elevated. It is possible to argue the contrary case, where roots and groundedness provide strength in solidity. But let's accept for the moment that verticality has the upper hand. What is certainly not preordained is that this vertical dimension is aligned along the Earth's longitude, in particular the arrangement where north is up and south is down. I'm sure the historical circumstances of this alignment are familiar to most of you, but let's look at the common story. We start with the ancient Greeks and the concept of antipodes, which is logically derived from the Pythagorean theory of the perfect sphere. We would follow this line to Cicero's Dream of Scipio, when the Roman general is transported into outer space to be shown a nether region of the world that Rome could never reach. The challenge of modern cartography, back up. Was to map this three-dimensional sphere onto a two-dimensional map. Before the Renaissance, there was a dizzying variety of orientations, such as this Aladrisi's influential tabula Rocheriana, drawn in 1154, showing south at the top. Naturally, it was the Europeans who turned this on its head. The Neapolitan Flavio Gioia created the modern mariner's compass as a suspended needle. In the 14th century, to please his patron, Charles of Anjou, he used the royal symbol of the fleur-de-lis to point north. This was then transposed to maps produced in Northern Europe, particularly in the days of the Dutch seaborne empire. For a while, there were many different orientations, but it was the north-oriented map of Geraldus Mercator, created in 1569, which provided the most popular with the Dutch, which proved the most popular with the Dutch merchants. Translated as new and more complete representation of the terrestrial globe properly adapted for use in navigation. And it became the killer app for Occidentalism. And we saw the world thus oriented forever after. This cartographic move framed colonialism as a superior north taking control of an inferior south. It clearly helped justify the invasion of other lands and the imposition of an imperial order. What may be less obvious is the enduring effect on those who live in the nether regions. In My Traitor's Heart, Rian Milan writes about growing up in South Africa. Our heads turned to the north like flowers to the sun, toward where the great white mother culture lay. The Brazilian writer Adília Borges described the experience of a stiff neck, always looking up to the north. And of course, we have the famous line attributed to Paul Keating about Australia as the arse end of the world. It seems useful for the decolonial project to contest this worldview, and I'd like to mention two counter moves. The first is to reverse this alignment. Placing south up often has a carnivalesque character, as in this Australian map by Stuart MacArthur. In South America, it has a more radical edge. I'm thinking particularly of the 1943 Incon paper by Joaquim Torres Garcia titled America Invertida, which became a school for his Escuela del Sur in Montevideo. And then in Buenos Aires itself, the literary scene around Borges sought to create a Paris of the South associated with the literary journal Sur. More recently, there is much interesting cultural work in Chile, particularly around the concept of abajismo, which might be roughly translated as downism, which embraces the slums of Santiago in particular. The culture of the Huachaca celebrates the crude life of the street, which has its own idioms of poetry, dance, and song. Imagine if Moomba merged with the Melbourne Writers' Festival. Of course, reversing the polarity only confirms verticality as an axis of value. The more radical move is a 180-degree turn to the horizontal. The Zapatista ideology of horizontalismo attempts to combine liberation struggle with a flat social hierarchy. In Buenos Aires, during the popular unrest of the financial crisis in 2001, horizontalismo was embraced as a mode of action. The noisy cacerolazo banging of pots and pans had no center. It was transmitted virally like a Mexican wave. Neighborhood initiatives such as barter systems were implemented. And underpinning this was an ideology of walking, we ask questions, a Zapatista model of change based on continuous collective negotiation. It's hard to find a parallel of horizontalism in British colonies such as Australia, except perhaps negatively in the tall poppy syndrome, but we may look up for an answer. In his book, Pattern Thinking, Jeremy Lent contrasts the Vedic and Greek root metaphors of high is good with the Chinese understanding of the path or Tao. This brings into contrast the idiom of journey as a national narrative with the default story of growth as a national narrative and an alternative to the default story of growth and development ever upwards. In modern Australia, we hear this evoked most often in the journey of reconciliation. Indeed, there's evidence of a generational change in the way we use maps while driving, where devices offer a choice between orienting the map north or in a direction you are currently moving. Older drivers prefer the world aligned with Mercator, while younger drivers go with the flow. Meanwhile, it seems important to the decolonial project that we denaturalize this spatial hierarchy by revealing its historicity as a metaphor. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. What a way. Now we have a paper by Leanne. Leanne.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen if that's okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present the final paper in this seminar series. So my paper is about the financial system, why it works the way it does, and what would it take to get a financial system that does not periodically descend into financial crises with all of the economic hardship that entails. But today, I'm hoping to focus on how I use a metaphor to frame and understand these questions. Let me start by introducing you to the origins of this metaphor. This quote came from the Citigroup CEO, one of the largest banks in the world, in the lead up to the global financial crisis. And what he was trying to do is explain why was his company still buying financial products, dancing, if you will, when the financial system had expanded well beyond the size of the real economy. In other words, when there were far more players than shares. And what he was basically saying through this metaphor is that as long as everyone else in the financial system was having fun chasing profits, Citigroup had to do the same. He was roundly condemned for these comments as being showing a lack of tact, but it is arguable that he also spoke aptly in comparing the financial system to a game of musical chairs. Game in which the aim is to dance and then beat everybody else to a seat. The first way I use the metaphor is to articulate what the problem actually is. What is the gap in the literature? If you look at literature on the financial system at a high level, it has a lot to say about the merits of the financial system, of how it works, criticizing essentially the game of musical chairs. The literature also suggests many alternative games that could be played, but it doesn't have a huge amount to say about how one might get from A to B. And this is the focus of my research. So my paper aims to take a first step by expanding the metaphor beyond the game to consider the party it is played at. It starts with the premise that the reason we play a game at all is because of how the party works in any circumstance. And therefore, the first step to solving the strategic problem of moving from an A to B in the financial system is to consider, how does the global financial system party work? This takes us to the second way I use the metaphor, which is to try and simplify this global financial system party into a theoretical model. As this series has been illustrating, a metaphor both describes reality and shapes our perceptions of it. And so the model aims to articulate this relationship between perception, reality, and action. At the global financial system party, there are two immovable components. A financial system will always have consumers and voters, financial sectors and governments, and only the most hardcore of free marketeers would suggest there should be no regulators. As for the 6 core social institutions that you see on your left in the realms of perception, these come from the institutional logic scholarship. The institutional logic scholars says that each of these 6 institutions, which you can see on the left, have a unique conception of interest, power, and risk associated with them. And each of these play a role in shaping what the partygoers perceive as their institutional constraints. These perceptions shape what they do, which alters their reality, which in turn affects these perceptions. And so what the model says is that the partygoers play musical chairs, the incumbent game, because there is generally a stable relationship between how they perceive their institutional constraints and the game. But this is not to say that the relationship is perfect. The metaphor can break down. As would happen during the global financial crises, and indeed many crises before that one, it comes along and there seems to be an apparent disjunct between perception and reality. If musical chairs seemed fun before, if the chasing of profit served economic interest pre-crisis, post-crisis, this no longer seems to be the case. And the system then can do one of 2 things at this point. It can revert to the incumbent institutional constraints and game. Everyone picks themselves up from the rough and tumble of the last crisis and then decides, well, musical chairs is still the game that we're used to playing and we're going to keep playing it. Or it can stabilize on new institutional constraints and game, as informed by the events that led to the crisis, causing that disruption between perception and reality. The historical literature suggests that in the financial system, at least, reversion is the normal pattern. And so what the theoretical model allows us to do is ask why and what would it take to create a stable alternative relationship with a new game that hopefully doesn't involve periodic financial crises. This brings us to the third way I use the metaphor in my paper, which is to create a framework for organizing political science and sociological scholarship to establish the nature of the relationships between what the partygoers perceive are the institutional constraints and the games they play. I've drawn on the research I did for a paper that I published in International Affairs in March this year to repackage it into these 4 unspoken rules that essentially explain the relationship between the institutions, the players, and their actions, which we find in the game of musical chairs. The first observations I make is that there is a place for all 6 of these core social institutions in these perceived roles. The primary perception of interest, power, and risk is economic. Consider what are the reasons you engage with the financial system, with the banking deposit, your superannuation, or insurance, or perhaps other investments. It will be typically your goal would be to protect, maintain, or grow wealth for as little as effort as possible. The way the partygoers perceive the law is to protect and further these economic interests. And wherever we are in the regulatory cycle, it tightens and loosens as our perceptions of what serves economic interest changes. Similarly, the voters use politics to instrumentally serve their own economic interest, which results in governments instrumentally using their social relationships with financial sectors, who for all intents and purposes to work out how to govern, and these financial sectors, for all intents and purposes, looks like they know a thing or two about generating wealth. And then, as for the institution of morality, when every other institution gives the financial sector power on account of their ability to serve their own economic interest, it should be unsurprising that there is little to no gap between their conceptions of the partygoers as to what their moral interests are and what their economic interests are. The second observation I make from this literature is that the rules define an aim and roles for all of the partygoers. And if some play their roles better than others, the vast majorities of the partygoers have the basic skills required to play the game. Consumers know how to buy and sell financial products. Whether they always do it in their best interest is not the point. It's that they know the basics of how to do that. They can dance, they can keep an eye on the seats. They know how to vote. The regulators have laws that they are familiar with enforcing and understand the policy frameworks behind. Uncle Sam knows how to win the affection of his voters. He knows how to relate to the financial sectors. And as for the financial sectors, they've been running businesses for a long time. And then the final observation you can make out of the existing literature is that there is a mechanism for excluding any player who doesn't play their assigned role to a minimum standard. People who lose their wealth without money can't engage in the financial system. When the regulators are seen to fail, their responsibilities get reshuffled. Obviously, if the government doesn't do what the voters want, they get disinvited at the ballot box. And as for people on the other side of the world, perhaps the global south that Kevin talked about, may be that they don't even get invited to this party. And so by expanding the metaphor beyond the game to the party, I'm able to deduce what it is about the party that results in the game getting played. This metaphorical model yields further insights, which I cover in my broader thesis work. But for the purpose of this paper, I focused on these three insights that the expanded metaphor provides that enable analysis of the strategic problem of getting us partygoers to play a different game. The first is that the partygoers can't ignore one of the core social institutions. If we want to play a different game, we need to define how it is to fit into the perceptions of the partygoers. Similarly, the partygoers cannot play a game if it's not clear what the aims, roles, and skills and mechanisms for exclusion are that make the game what it is. Then finally, the partygoers will not play a game unless its features aligns with its perceived sets of institutional constraints. If we want to dance away from financial crises, we need to work out how to make these three conditions at a minimum to deliver upon a new game. And so finally, to return to the original metaphor and today's theme of remaking the world, one metaphor at a time. As this series has shown, metaphors both assist us to understand and hide the reality of the world. But what my paper does is to use the metaphor to make a bridge between those of us who simultaneously understand and hide this reality. If the Citigroup CEO used the metaphor to hide the real gravity of his decisions, the condemnation of it hid the reality of the truth it contained. My paper does neither. It uses the metaphor to solve. As children, we might recall the bruises and scraped knees after having been railroaded into playing musical chairs at a birthday party. Yet as adults, have we not passed down the same game, same as those before us? In accepting both the reality and the gravity of the way we choose to make our financial system work as a society, as conveyed by the metaphor, my paper moves beyond the hurt and condemnation associated with it, to instead use the metaphor to work out how to escape the bubble we have been trapped in. Thank you.
Thank you, Leanne. Fantastic! What a great way to finish this this session. And I like the way the three papers are beside each other, not in any other way related to each other. So we have about 40 minutes. That's sensational. We should take a full advantage of this opportunity, and I'm pleased to see that many of the scholars who have contributed to the previous sessions are also here. So as well as discussing these three papers, perhaps we could draw from the whole series also. Let's do it.
Could I just start by asking Leanne, in terms of your paper, are we right to think that with this musical chairs metaphor, that stopping the music is a metaphor for the law? Is that right?
Yes. So if we think of stopping what happened in the global financial crisis, everyone started getting a bit nervous because people knew there were more people than chairs, so to speak. And so as that was happening, the regulators were tightening monetary policy. They were also increasing the prudential standards, which basically said how much the banks needed to keep aside to ensure that they could absorb any losses from people who weren't able to pay back loans. And so it wasn't a hard flip the way the game works, but there reaches a point where everybody decides that they're not going to keep buying into the game of buying financial products, and that's when you can say the music gets turned off.
Yes. Also, as well as the question of a metaphor, which is our focus, we should also perhaps consider the question of etymology, because of course a party is by definition a part. It's exclusive by definition, right? So there's also that to be considered. If we embrace an exclusive metaphor, what are the implications and so on? So floor is open.
Perhaps I might start by responding to that idea of exclusion. And I think it's a question, I guess, as a society, is it possible to live without a degree of exclusion? The exclusion is the threat that I suppose makes us do work the way the rest of society wants us to work and enables us to cooperate, is the threat of exclusion. The question is, do we want the threat of the basis on which people are being excluded? Is that the right basis? And can we construct a different game in which perhaps maybe an alternative basis for exclusion is better?
Yes, I wasn't implying that you were recommending exclusion. I was inviting us to reflect on the nature of exclusion. Carlos.
Hi, Lorenzo. Thank you. Hi, everybody. And thanks for those three really interesting papers. I love how we finished with Leanne's paper with which is presenting a model built on a metaphor, right? So the series finishes with the paper presenting the metaphor as a model through which to interact with policy and seek out changes. So that's really interesting. But I wanted to raise a question for Kevin. Kevin, so in your paper, I love all the references to the Latin American Southern stuff. Thank you. In your paper, you began by kind of talking about the importance of the verticalism as an axis for organizing kind of our spatial coordinates, cartography, mapping, politics, etc. And then, if I understood correctly, the move you then make, kind of the critical move you make in a way, is to then point, to say that the way out of that is not to simply invert the to not remain within the parameters of the vertical axis, i.e. inverted from north to south, which has been partly the decolonial move, but rather to shift out of it, right? And to sort of say that the opposite of that vertical axis is outside the vertical axis, right? So hence horizontalism. But then I felt that the paper finished, you know. So then, you know, after you said a few things about that, the paper finished in a way I wanted to hear a bit more about your reflection on that. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Carlos. I was thinking of you while I was writing this paper. And there was obviously a lot more to be said about horizontal forms of alignment, and particularly thinking about movements across the South, the global South, the various Mercosur and so on organizations that attempt to connect with each other. But I do feel as though it's, in terms of an understanding of connection, it's still undeveloped across the South, the idea of the horizontal axis. And it is still something that, you know, the vertical is still such a powerful lure in terms of aspirationalism, in terms of something to look up to. And there are times when, like, the Southern Hemisphere becomes a B league, where to be the greatest or the largest in the Southern Hemisphere becomes something to aspire to, but it's still always in the shadow of the North. When we did the South project, we found the flightless bird as a very powerful symbol for countries of the South, in the sense that flightless birds are located in the South, the penguin, the emu, the ostrich, the kiwi, and so on. And because they're basically island birds, yet what they share in common is what they can't connect with, because being unable to fly is a way in which they cannot connect with each other. And most of the axes in which the South is connected are still via the northern centers, such as in museums like the V&A and the Smithsonian, and fashion in Paris, and still film in Hollywood, and so on. So something like the bird migrations and these flightless birds provides an alternative symbol, which has sometimes been invoked when trying to imagine the South as being something other than at the bottom of the world. But I think that's still an important creative process ahead.
Right. Of course, Kevin, how much do you think the orientation of our mapping is due to the fact that Earth has its own magnetism, and that if you are relying on a compass, you are looking north. So there is, you know, there are also technical elements to this orienting.
Well, you could still say, Lorenzo, that it's a matter of choice as to whether that, I mean, the needle is pointing along the magnetic axis. Whether you put north above south is still an arbitrary decision. The Chinese, for instance, when they had their particular compass, which was a kind of a floating tortoise, that would be pointing south. It was the inverse of the Western compass. So, and I think it's just particularly interesting to go back to that time around the Renaissance and to see the variety of different maps, not just whether south or north above each other, but maps the idea of orientation is obviously about pointing east, which was what an early European map, but other maps that were like two hearts that used the less, and tried to deal with putting a sphere onto a flat surface in other kind of graphic ways. But it was really the fact that it was the merchants commissioning Mercator who said, this is the one we want, suggesting an alignment of that particular interest, which in which the die was cast in the sense of north being up. And I guess the idea, going back to Borges, is that that these metaphors, once they become so much part of our history, that they cease to feel like metaphors, they can ingrain certain other kind of collateral damage, such as light and knowledge become something aligned to skin color. And so North being superior becomes aligned to colonialism in terms of the different races. And I guess part of the project and, you know, like the work that Danish and Andre are doing, exploring different metaphors during lockdown is to try and deconstruct these, which I presume is one of the aims of this series.
For sure, for sure. In the English language, I don't want to hog this, but in the English language, there are ways of promoting a kind of horizontalism. So, for example, when we say sterling, something is sterling, it's something positive, right? And it's because it comes from the fact that silver coined in the East was of a superior quality, and so it was called Easterling. And hence, you know, there are ways of recovering sort of sideways metaphors. And also with regards to Danish and Andre, you guys went on a journey, right?
Is that the question? Sorry.
It wasn't a question, it was an observation. You went on a journey for the purpose of your critical engagement. And the fact that the journey was spatially constrained, you know, informed your proceedings. I was just inviting a reflection on the metaphor of the journey.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah, it's interesting to think about the idea of the journey being opposed to a kind of aspirational spatiality, which we hadn't been, because we've been thinking more along the lines of it maybe being opposed to the digging down, kind of uncovering type metaphors for critique, but putting it in relation to also the upwards or that kind of verticalism. That kind of verticalism is really interesting as well, and I think that could be something fruitful for us in thinking of what kind of, yeah. I mean, we were wondering throughout this process of, you know, why present it in this way of making it this journey rather than, I guess, that you might do otherwise is you go away and do the thinking and come back with something fully formed, a theory of post-critical realism. That I think we were very deliberately trying to cover up our tracks in that way, or pretend that we had reached a point that we hadn't. And so which is why I think we chose to stage the journey in the presentation.
Stage the journey while being locked down and able to go nowhere.
Melinda, I think your the connection's a bit spotty.
Can I say something?
Absolutely.
I'll turn my video off and see if that works better now. I've been having some internet connection issues in here today on Zoom. Thanks very much to all four of you. They were really great talks. And I just see Des has landed in with us, which is fabulous timing, because I wanted to take us back to actually a point that Des made last week, which was that he introduced metamorphosis into our discussion. And when he was pushed, and I was very keen to come back to this, but we didn't have a chance last week. When he was pushed on this point, Des seemed to step back a little bit on the question of whether metamorphosis was something qualitatively different from metaphor or not, or whether metamorphosis was a bringing about of some kind of profound change, that whereas metaphor was something else. I mean, something that's been very striking to me through these talks is the possibility that metaphor becomes its own circularity making machine. You go from metaphor to metaphor to metaphor. And obviously there's something in the idea of post-critical reading that lends itself to that kind of model. And I'm very, very keen to hear from Danish and Andre about this. I mean, towards the end of your paper, you gave us this idea of tiny glimpses of utopia. And then Kevin, you know, the verticality to horizontality thing, from one perspective, can be read as having, you know, very radical change at its heart, the very idea of flipping forms of domination and so on. But from another perspective, it might be seen as a simple reinforcement of the same kind of relationship, just with different dominators and different dominated, if you like. And then with Leanne, I was thinking both about the idea of dancing for what. Okay, so the idea of whether there's some kind of qualitative change that can come about in a financial system beyond the idea of the system itself being perpetuated. Look, all I'm trying to do here is spark a bit of a discussion about whether, and it's a question I raised really early in the discussion, I suppose, whether metaphor gives us anything of a transformative kind, or whether it just helps us see that we need transformation. So I'd love to hear from all of you or any of you who...
Yeah, thanks, Melinda. I think we kind of started having this conversation just yesterday. Andre kind of touches on this in the conclusion, like you noted. So this idea of the grand epiphany, or not actually having the grand epiphany. And I guess one way to think about this is to go back to what Rita Felsky is trying to do with post-critique. So the idea of post-critique in some ways is to redescribe the air of literary studies, and to redescribe it in such a way that you then expand the atmosphere of literary studies. So you then say that actually this critique isn't as neutral or as dispassionate as you might think it might be, that it comes attached to a set of moods. So even to be dispassionate is a certain kind of mood. And if I recognize it as such, then what other possibilities might manifest themselves? So, so in a sense, then, if you think of this as a journey or an attempt at a kind of training, it's to kind of try and inhabit those other possibilities. But I think Andre uses this word towards the end about oscillation. So you never actually, so it's not like we now sit here as people who are stolidly post-critical and, you know, completely reparative to the exception of everything else. So it's more that it feels now that there are these other ways of being that are available. And I mean, I think the other point that's kind of crucial here is that it seems very determined and it's very much relational to everyday reality. So it's a lot easier right now with Melbourne coming out of lockdown again to remember those utopian bents of mine, to remember the nourishment, the nurturance of repair than it might have been in August when we were in a very different kind of mindset.
I think just to add to that, Andre, that Leanne, your story of the musical chairs in a way seems to quite well represent the way metaphors functioned in our series. As to go back, I think, to one of the original talks, looking at the Greek etymology of metaphor as a vehicle, as a way of moving, that there's a sense in which the reality is not in the metaphor, but the metaphor helps us move from one way of seeing to another. And what this series has revealed is the fact that metaphors can become tied to certain interests, and certain perspectives can become congealed around them that may be oppressive in different ways. And by understanding its metaphoricity, it's possible then to change metaphors or to look at metaphors that might fit better so that they're not seen as part of the natural order. And it's been interesting to me how many, I don't know in the Institute whether there's been as much contribution from law in terms of legal scholarship, but it does seem to have a particular interest in the degree to which in legal thinking, in terms of justice, whether there are alternatives to, whether metaphor, how metaphor fits within the concept of justice, whether it's a way of achieving justice or something which can blind us in some way. I don't know if Danish and Andre, whether you had something to add to that as the legal scholars.
Okay, so this is, thank you for that question. I think we could give another presentation on that point right now, but just to kind of restrict my enthusiasm. So one of the questions that I'm trying to explore in my thesis, which does intersect with this in some ways, is the idea of what a reparative kind of jurisprudence might look like. And so that is very much built on the metaphor of repair in some ways. And I'm kind of struggling because that opens up a very extended line of inquiry if I start talking about it. So which I was going to ask you if you want to kind of, okay. Yeah. So I guess like one of the questions that kind of come up there is a lot of practices or a lot of ways of working with jurisprudence are oriented towards looking at questions of injustice, as you kind of said. So what is the harm that happens here? How do we expose the said harm that happens? And if you orient yourself towards repair, you ask a very different set of questions. So not so much about what is the harm that happens, but then as people who live with a law which we recognize to be oppressive, how do we then find nourishing and reparative and joyful ways of trying to coexist and cohabit with the law? So it orients, so I guess like that for me is a very productive kind of inquiry. And that's just one particular metaphor which I'm working on, but yeah.
Des, I don't know if you want to jump in now.
Yeah, I can quickly jump in. You know, I'm trying to get up to speed, as you can imagine, but I think Melinda's been thinking about this, and she said she'd raised this issue earlier on. I mean, I think there is a real difference between metaphor and metamorphosis. They are different kinds of processes, and one way of putting that is a metamorphosis is, as I understand it, a kind of a structural or an organic process that we're drawing attention to, whereas a metaphor is a semantic process, which might be a way of explaining those things or a way of explaining different things. So they are operating on different levels of analysis. But of course, at the same time, the boundaries are fluid, because if you think about most of the examples of metaphors, the examples of metamorphosis I raised last time, for example, Ovid's Metamorphoses or the Metamorphosis in Kafka, those images are used precisely as metaphors. So they are referring to this kind of structural change, psychological change, organic change, immanent, internal, something like that. They are referring to a very specific process of movement, we might say, in the real world, but then they are used metaphorically. Almost all of Ovid's Metamorphoses draw attention to things that are then applied metaphorically to, that's like, you know, the mother-child relationship, or that's like the move from colonial to post-colonial societies, or whatever it happens to be. So there's a crossover there where our structural or institutional thinking inevitably needs a semantic element, and that semantic element is itself a kind of movement, which is when metaphor comes in.
Yes, also, I mean, this should have been probably brought forward earlier, but there is a distinction to be made between the metaphor as an object and the metaphor as method. I could say we must reclaim a literal understanding of decolonization, because without that literal understanding, we risk obfuscating the issues. But I may use a rich, metaphorically written, powerful way of constructing my argument, and to give power for that project. So, yeah. There's very few of us remaining.
Well, maybe we want to declare victory.
Well, someone should eventually.
Just like Biden.
He's
biding his time.
Yeah. I know. Trump's played all his cards.
Perhaps if I come in, because there's a question I wanted to ask Leanne, and I guess it relates to what we're doing here in the sense of this discursive process of looking at metaphors and understanding how they work. And within this kind of academic setting in terms of practice, whether there's a moment which we try and enact that, or to try and have an effect in discourse outside the academy in some way. So I'm wondering, for instance, Leanne, in your work with discussing, the financial crisis and so on, around this metaphor of musical chairs, do you see a way in which it's possible to take that outside the academy in some way? Is it something that you see as having the capacity to perhaps demystify the financial world for many people?
I guess I've always seen my work sort of trying to bridge the almost utopian world of like how we would like the financial system to work and the practicalities of those working outside academia who are actually on the ground making the regulatory decisions, like the political decisions, the business decisions that make the financial system run, because the system just doesn't exist otherwise. And we wouldn't, as a society, necessarily want to go to like a barter system where you didn't have money and financial systems. Like that would be that would mean that we could not have anywhere near the kind of economic luxuries that we have, like, if you went back like, a few thousand years where we had a barter system. So it's sort of intercepting that the financial system is here to stay and understanding how the people in the system, all the constraints on them, that we can have a more constructive discussion about how we can help the people who are actually having to make the decisions on the ground, make decisions in a way that is more, I guess, reaching those ideals of having like things like an inclusive and sustainable economy. And if you look at like, the theoretical underpinnings of why we have a financial system in the first place, it is to make transaction costs lower. It is to make sure that we don't waste resources in how we allocate their usage. And so there is a value match between the theoretical underpinnings and a lot of the, I guess, academic hopes for what the financial system should be doing that is different to perhaps how it actually turns out as a matter of execution when you see things like the global financial crises happen.
For sure.
So in perhaps another way of thinking about it is like, if you think of how economics as a theoretical framework operates, it's one-dimensional. It has this notion of self-interest, and then the law comes in to correct how people behave when there is not just self-interest. And what my thesis does is bring in all of the other dimensions of how we think about interest into the equation for working out how do we run the system in a regulatory sense.
Okay. As Des recommended, I think we should declare victory. And it's important that we finish without a firm answer as to usefulness of metaphor, which is a metaphor of our endeavors, possibly. Des?
I just wanted to say thank you to everybody. I think we've had not only a really fantastic selection of papers, but a pretty loyal audience whose patience I can see we're gradually trying. But, you know, over the whole period, it's been a long series. There's been a lot of papers, and I think as I said, I think we've managed to keep a really good audience, and hopefully given everybody ways of thinking about their own work and about the world around them in different ways. Lorenzo, you and I will have to talk a little bit next week about if there's anything we want to do with some of these papers, or, you know, like what else might come out of it. But I think, you know, what's come out of it has been a great experience, and I've certainly enjoyed my time in this series. I've looked forward to Friday lunchtimes, and I'd like us to be doing something, a similar kind of thing on an interesting theme next year, because I think it's been really pleasant and productive. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Melinda.
Next year.
Thank you, Don. Thank you, Lorenzo.
Thank you,
Curzon Street.
Indeed.
See you all.